truly thrilled to introduce our next speaker, Margaret Morton. Margaret has been engaged with the photographic representation of alternative built environments for over 20 years. Her 4 published books form a permanent record of the temporary habitats that Manhattan's homeless individuals created for themselves in the public parks, vacant lots, abandoned buildings, along the waterfronts, and beneath the city streets. These books are Transitory Gardens, Uprooted Lives, co-authored with Diana Balmori, The Tunnel, the Underground Homeless of New York City, Fragile Dwelling, and Glass House. Margaret's photographs have been published in numerous anthologies and presented in more than 80 exhibitions throughout the world. She is professor of art at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in New York City. But perhaps more importantly, she is an individual with a unique artistic sensibility, deeply attuned to the human condition and humanity's core values, our need, among other things, for gardens to sustain the body and the soul. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Morton.
Thank you, Annette and Naomi. It's been such a pleasure to be here and to finally meet you. And it's my pleasure to be here today and meet all of you. I will be talking about the gardens that the homeless people create for themselves, but I'm also going to be showing how they create their habitats, because it's very important to me to show you the struggle they really go through to get to the point where they're thinking about a garden and adding a garden. And their gardens are made from trash, primarily, and so I've titled my talk, Urban Detritus, Utopian Dreams. In 1989, when my documentation of New York City's homeless communities began, there were, in fact, more homeless New Yorkers than at any time since the Great Depression. 25,000 homeless poor sought beds in city shelters each night. Thousands more slept outside. These encampments, not seen on such a scale since the Hoovervilles of the 1930s, also filled public parks. The largest of these was Tompkins Square Park in the East Village, where 150 homeless people had set up tents by the late 1980s. The tents were makeshift and used the park furniture, fences, and trees for supporting structures. This tent incorporated a wheeled Bloomingdale's garment bag for structure as well as storage. Some homeless individuals slept on dark park benches and encased their food and possessions in plastic bags, which they hung from the park fence to fend off the ever-present rats. Nathaniel Hunter, who was nicknamed the mayor of the park because he spoke on behalf of his other homeless friends, built the largest tent in the park. He also made a garden, an array of found objects nestled in a bed of dried leaves and twigs. I built the tent around a park bench, Nathaniel told me. I've got a place. I've got a garden. Some people want to add to it. Some want to take from it. Some add something and come back and see if it's still there a week later. I even had a praying mantis. I would bring him out to play in the garden in the daytime. And at night, I put him on a stick and I put him back in a cage, and I keep him in my tent. The Tompkins Square Park homeless community was evicted by police in 1989. The men and women fled the park with whatever they could carry and watched while their possessions were destroyed. Many made their way back. 18 months later, a phalanx of police in riot gear routed the homeless community from the park and closed it for renovation. When the park reopened 2 years later, a curfew was imposed. After the park was cleared by police, many of the homeless women and men relocated to abandoned vacant lots just a few blocks east. As you can see, the sign on the diagonal sign says LES for Lower East Side, and then Dinkinsville. And David Dinkins was mayor at the time, and he was criticized very strongly for being supportive of homeless people's rights and understanding that they did not want to sleep in these 1,000-bed armories where there was fear of tuberculosis and also knife fights. And he actually lost the next election for mayor, and primarily it was attributed to his advocacy for homeless people. In other parts of the city, homeless individuals perched makeshift dwellings along the seawalls of the East River. More than 2,000 men and women found their way underground, living beneath the city's streets, hidden in subway and railroad tunnels. As the situation worsened, a startling phenomenon occurred. Homeless people began to improvise housing for themselves. Shantytowns soon became visible on the East Village and Lower East Side vacant lots, barren since the arsons of the mid-1970s, when landlords had their own buildings torched so that they could collect the insurance money. The homeless builders clustered their dwellings into small villages that provided a sense of community and security. One can see in these homes, laid bare by circumstance, not only a need for shelter, privacy, and security, but one can also see the profound human need that we all share to personalize, to adorn, to collect, and to display. By demand, not by design, private spaces were sometimes made public. Toilets were non-existent or improvised. A makeshift shower was rigged to a fire hydrant, then quickly disconnected to disappear into a shack for safekeeping. Some communities survived for several years and gradually expanded into more permanent settlements. In the late 1980s, 12 homeless men and 2 women assembled plywood houses in a vacant lot on East 4th Street. They'd come to New York from the villages of Puerto Rico, young men and women with dreams of a better life. Soon they discovered low pay, illness, and bad luck. 30 years later, they were unemployed and homeless, but not without the will to survive. They cleared debris from the deserted lot, scavenged building materials in the early morning hours, and constructed plywood houses along a central path. In spite of, or perhaps because of, their unfortunate circumstances, references to happier times abound. The residents continually embellished their homes with additions that stirred memories of places they had left behind. Interior courtyards, painted rock gardens, and open porches recalled their childhood homes in Puerto Rico. Salsa music filled the air. Pepe Otero took over a friend's 3-walled shack. When I took over this was nothing. Only this room, he told me. I was living in Tompkins Square Park for 6 months. I made my tent there with plastic bags. It was up to me to keep my surroundings clean. I was born in Puerto Rico in the countryside. In the 7th grade, I started bookbinding in a little print shop. There I learned typesetting and printing. I was 16 years old. From there, I went to San Juan. I came to this country when I was 17 because somebody told me I would make more money in typesetting. When I got here, I got a big bad surprise. I had made twice that much money in Puerto Rico. Pepe set to work to expand the shack and make it his home. First, he repaired the roof. It was so low, I had to push it up 2 inches more. Sorry. I put in a new beam, this one in the center. It had so many leaks, leaking all over. I added the awning. I've improved it, and I'm going to improve it some more, try to make it better for next winter. Pepe's improvements included a tool room, which served not only to safeguard his tools and building materials, but provided a workshop where he could earn money repairing lamps, radios, and cassette players for people who lived in the surrounding tenements. Pepe added metal window grates cut from shopping carts to protect his home from vandalism by local gangs who cut through the lot. He built a front porch and enclosed it with a fence of discarded plastic bakery trays, and he framed the entrance with bedposts that he found in the trash. I'm going to make the porch look better. I'm going to make it whistle in the summertime and sit outside. The The following spring, Pepe paved the path in front of his home with marble tiles that had been discarded from an apartment renovation a block away. With the help of his friend Pepito, Pepe dug holes for the fence posts. Pepe covered his walkway with a marquesina. In Puerto Rico, we have things like that, he told me. The roofed walkway also connected his house to a vegetable garden, which he had walled with a double tier of plastic bread trays. Pepe gently tended his garden and proudly harvested squash and string beans, which he shared with other members of the community. Over 4 years, Pepe worked tirelessly to transform his plywood shack into a 5-room home. During the winter months, he dreamed of new building projects. The tool room is still unfinished, too cold now. I'd like to finish the kitchen. Then I'm going to start a bathroom, as soon as the weather gets a little warmer, if I'm still alive. My house in Puerto Rico, it was beautiful. A big house with a balcony and so many rooms. Pepe's neighbor, excuse me, sorry. Pepe's neighbor, Hector Amasquita, who is nicknamed Ganeo for his love of bananas, built a house for himself in the same vacant lot. Directly behind his dwelling was an empty residential building, its doors and windows sealed with bricks. Hector's home was a 3-part composition of house, courtyard, and a painted rock garden that recalled his childhood home in Puerto Rico. Hector also liked to collect signs. So when he found a sign on the path that read Bushville, this was 1992, he added it to his courtyard fence. Hector's enclosed courtyard was his oasis, where he enjoyed quiet mornings reading the daily newspaper. An inflated palm tree that he found in the trash was his prize find and was admired by the other Puerto Rican men who had built their dwellings on the same vacant lot. Another treasure was a salvaged garden statue, but the bucket and plastic container were necessities used to transport water from a fire hydrant a block away, for there was no water supply or electricity on the vacant lot. The following summer, Hector extended his plantings of bugbane to both sides of the entrance. In August, he added a roof over the courtyard for shade, but left it open to catch the breezes. A clothespin wheel that Hector attached to refrigerator shelving was transformed into a decorative flower atop his courtyard garden fence. By late autumn, Hector had completely enclosed his courtyard and added a roof to prepare the house for the impending cold. I have to think of something to keep this place warm, he said. The porch roof is not ready for winter. I have to make it better. When winter came, Hector moved his cooking fire indoors and painted his walls to better display his collections of found sculpture and musical instruments. This is my work. I can't work here, I can't work there. This is something I've got to do with my life. I figure if I don't do something here, my mind will die. I started like a poor person, but now I feel better, now I feel comfortable. This is the first time I do something for myself. I'm on to 55, too much for me. For me, it's like 100. The following spring, Hector did a second planting, surrounded by a string fence tied to 4 corner posts. He decorated his house with small animal heads and a plastic pineapple. That same summer, workmen renovated the abandoned apartment building behind his home that I'd mentioned earlier. His home could now be easily observed from restored windows, which previously had been bricked shut. The new tenants, low-income families, started to complain about the homeless community, which they viewed from the windows of their freshly painted apartments. Despite its look of permanence, the homeless community could not endure. The residents had been warned of impending eviction, but they'd made no preparations because they had nowhere to go. Early on a cold December morning, the bulldozers arrived. People quickly gathered their belongings. The noise of the heavy equipment was deafening. Massive shovels entered the lot and wrenched the small houses from their foundations. Hector Amasquita's house. Then Pepe Otero's 5-room home. The bulldozers held the small houses high, then hurled them to the ground. In moments, the community was destroyed. Everyone scattered, seeking temporary shelter in doorways, abandoned cars, or with friends. while their homes fell splintered, piles of refuse once again. James Hayward created a garden that was intended to protect his tent from this type of demolition and to frighten away intruders. He used rocks that he found on the lot and bricks from a nearby construction site. He found enamel paint in the trash of a car body shop that was right next door. James would wash the rocks, sand them, paint them, sand them again, paint them again, sand them again, until the surface was smooth, before painting the final images. He was very proud of how well he maintained his tent, yard, and garden. "We have the #1 tent and the #1 garden," James told me. "Every morning we clean and rake our yard. Every time you walk by here, you see it clean. We have a lady head with a knife in it, and there's a gun pointing at her. That's for a reason, because a lot of people know that means trouble. Even the cop, he knows what it means. That's for a meaning. Away, folks. And we leave it outside at nighttime, and nobody ever touches it." 2 blocks from James Hayward's garden, behind a high chain-link fence, on East 11th Street, a sign warns, "You shall be dealt with." Intrigued by the curious scene that I'd observed through the fence, but frustrated by the forest of ailanthus that obscured my view, I removed the sign and crawled through a narrow opening. A frayed metal wire, barely visible, was strung 3 feet from the pavement and grabbed at my clothing. Inside, there were more than 100 stuffed animals and dolls. The stuffed animals had been exposed to the elements for so long that they were hardened like cement. It was summer, and with the foliage and the play of light and shade beneath the trees, at first glance, this menagerie and coterie seemed a garden of Eden for abandoned stuffed animals, discarded dolls, and plants that are often considered weeds. The entire lot was filled with careful compositions of these 3 elements. The plants were both living and plastic, the dolls were nestled among the stuffed animals, and the animals seemed arranged in such a way that they were watching over the dolls. But on closer observation, it became evident that although the stuffed animals were left completely intact and seemed to be guarding the dolls themselves were often maimed. Heads and arms, wrenched from bodies, were left there, detached. A Garden of Eden or a Garden of Evil? This eerie juxtaposition of lush vegetation, intact stuffed animals, and dolls with severed heads and limbs created a sense of imminent danger that was pervasive. Both of the gardeners were recluses. Maria lived alone in the crumbling, abandoned 5-story building adjacent to the lot, which was labeled as unsafe for occupancy, and Anna lived in a tenement across the street. Both had come to Manhattan from Eastern Europe after World War II. Several blocks south, Jimmy carved an oval pond from the hard dirt of a sun-baked lot on the Lower East Side. He lined the pond with black plastic garbage bags and filled it with water from a nearby fire hydrant. Jimmy bordered the pond with fragments of brick and stone from the rubble of an abandoned building and stocked it with goldfish that flickered in the sunlight. Streaks of orange would suddenly break the water's surface and disappear. He told me that teenage boys would come into the lot and steal his goldfish or just leave them on the edge to die, but that he always replaced them with what little money he got from recycling cans. In the back of the lot, Jimmy grew corn and tomatoes and slept in a small tent. Leaning back in his chair, he recalled his boyhood home in South Carolina. Sunlight filtering through lace curtains, a piano in the parlor, and a house overlooking a pond. I returned 8 days later, bringing photographs and a tape recorder, but Jimmy, his fish pond, the tent, and the garden were gone. It seemed as though his idyllic setting had never existed. 2 homeless men who lived on the sidewalk outside of the fence told me that a bulldozer had arrived with no warning, and that Jimmy, highly distraught at losing his home and fish pond, had wandered the neighborhood for a few days, then disappeared. John Pitts created what Gloria Curry, the art historian, has described as a Palladian villa that is a rebuke to the high-rise. And I think that's such a perfect description. And she said, in fact, it might also be called utopian. And I thought that was a perfect quote to bring into this conference. And John Pitts lived in many locations. I have photographed him for years, living in parks and schoolyards and abandoned buildings, and this was one of his other places, and he created a very elaborate garden and a fish pond as well, and it attracted the young children from the neighborhood at a time that the neighborhood was a very bad place to grow up, and so I think he also was kind of an unofficial scout leader for a group of young boys. The homeless community known as The Hill was in Chinatown, on an empty lot that borders the Canal Street off-ramp of the Manhattan Bridge. Bypassed by a steady stream of traffic from Brooklyn, The Hill gained renown for its highly visible homeless community and the unusual dwellings. After Ivan moved onto The Hill, he quickly transformed his makeshift lean-to into a more permanent home. He paved a walkway, hung decorations, and planted a tiny garden. When Shaft and Lisa took over the house, they raised the roof up 4 inches and started selling Christmas wreaths, which they assembled from found bits of discarded evergreen and ribbon, and they sold them to the truck drivers who were constantly stuck in traffic right on the other side of their house as they were exiting the Manhattan Bridge from Brooklyn. Shaft and Lisa kept the original walkway of Ivan, but the garden disappeared. Shaft and Lisa defined a front lawn from discarded wall-to-wall carpeting, which they found in the trash. This addition of a front yard extended their private space within the community and created semi-public space that they could still claim as their own. After Shaft added the Dutch door, Sammy, a neighbor, complained, "This place is starting to look like Queens." The most curious home on the Hill was that of Mr. Lee, who had arrived at the encampment without a word in 1989, carrying his possessions in a burlap sack. He soon astonished his neighbors by constructing a house without sawing a board or pounding a nail. Instead, his house was bound together with knots. Bright yellow plastic straps wrapped his soft, rounded hut, binding old mattresses and bed springs into walls. The exterior was festooned with red bakery ribbons, paper lanterns, and cast-off calendars that celebrated the Chinese New Year. Oranges, Chinese symbols of prosperity, had hardened in the bitter cold and hung from straps like ornaments. Mr. Lee's house was a garden. Mr. Lee's life revolved around the ongoing creation and recreation of his home. The majestic cluster of fruit atop his roof was in fact a teddy bear, which he had found on the street and bound so tightly with knots that it had been skillfully transformed. Each day at dawn, Mr. Lee left the Hill, and he placed a stone against the door that he'd made from discarded loading pallets. He further secured it with more of his elaborate knots. Mr. Lee slowly wandered the streets of Chinatown with 2 burlap rice sacks slung over his shoulder, pausing to collect bits of cloth and cord left by the morning delivery trucks. In the early evening, Mr. Lee returned, and with great ceremony, tied his new treasures to the exterior of his hut. At 5 o'clock in the morning, on May 29, 1992, an arsonist seeking revenge on another resident set fire to Mr. Lee's home. He died in the blaze. A neighbor who had also lost his home in the fire and barely survived erected this memorial to Mr. Lee. Yi Po Lee, he was one of us. A massive concrete pier stretches out into the Hudson River at West 44th Street. To the south, sightseeing boats arrive and depart on the hour. To the north, tourists swarm over the Intrepid, the World War II aircraft carrier. The 7 men on the wharf seem oblivious to these activities as they go about their work, building their homes. Angelo's hut has 2 small gardens, planted with children's toys and guarded by a driftwood snake. A hand-painted wooden sign, Aldi, marks the entrance to his 4-foot-high home. Angelo bends low to enter, A taller visitor must crawl on her hands and knees. The interior mysteriously seems to expand. There is a bed, a dresser, a writing desk with a lamp, a basket filled with clothes, a collection of toys, framed photographs on the walls, an American flag, and a handmade calendar on which Angelo marks off each day. The tunnel. The most long-standing of the homeless communities in Manhattan survived for over 23 years in an abandoned railroad tunnel that stretches for 2.5 miles under Manhattan's Riverside Park. Those who arrived first moved into pre-existing concrete structures that had been used by the railroad workers until the freight service went bankrupt in the early 1970s. Those who arrived in the 1980s built plywood shanties for themselves, which they clustered beneath air vents. Shafts of daylight punctuated the darkness. When Bernard Isaac arrived in the early 1980s, he took over a concrete room deep into the tunnel. He carefully handpicked the other homeless people to share this secret hiding place. And by the late 1980s, his camp, as he called it, had grown to 17 men and women. Bernard cooked for those who contributed food. Seeds from Riverside Park would fall through the air vents and occasionally would sprout. Bernard would nurture the sprouts as best he could and water them when they took root. Bernard told me, once the weather really gets warm, certain seeds will drop through the grate from up top. Things sprout over here. This area has always had plant life. We've even had tomato plants. It will be interesting to see what comes up this spring. I guess you saw some of the melon seeds over there. I always throw the seeds of the watermelon on the mound. Some of them sprout, and the vines will grow down the hill. They always end up dying, but whatever. It's just good to see something green under here. That's why I do it all the time. But Bernard had lived in the tunnel for 11 winters. He knew that the gardens would not survive. At night, Bernard searched the streets of the Upper West Side, where residents and restaurant workers left discarded trash along the streets for garbage collection. Bernard found foodstuffs for his grill and plants for his underground garden. I had a couple fruit trees, but I didn't really protect them in the wintertime, and they died. It was amazing. It was either an orange or a lemon tree, and the thing survived up until the middle of December. The first heavy snowstorm killed it, of course, but it blew my mind. I envision when I leave here that I'm going to leave something behind. I'd like to leave something like a plant or a tree behind, and one day return here and say, look how my tree has grown. That would be great to see. After Amtrak workers restored the tracks for passenger service to Albany and Montreal, and Donald Trump started his large-scale housing complex near the south entrance, pressures increased to remove the tunnel community, which had grown to 50 men and women. Through a federal grant program and the combined efforts of Coalition for the Homeless and Project Renewal, many of the tunnel residents were relocated into supportive housing. Before he left the tunnel for an apartment in Harlem, Joe, a Vietnam veteran who had moved into the tunnel in 1973 after he'd returned from 2 tours of duty in Vietnam and found that he could not readjust to civilian life, painted the date of his arrival on the column base right outside his underground home. Amtrak workers, concerned that the former tunnel residents might try to return, destroyed all of the dwellings, including the concrete rooms. The day before the bulldozers arrived, Joe marked his departure date as well, July 26, 1996. Joe had lived in the tunnel for 23 years. I continue to visit many of the former tunnel residents, including Joe and Kathy, Bernard. Kathy had met Joe in Riverside Park and joined him underground for his last 8 years there. When I asked them if there was anything about the tunnel that they missed, Kathy surprised me. She responded that she would never miss the bitter cold or lack of water and electricity or the rats, which she complained about all the time she was down there. But she said, I do miss something. I miss those shafts of light. she said that when she used to be feeling so depressed down there, she would just stand in one of those shafts in a single beam and just bathe herself in the light. Thank you. Are there any questions? It's hard to see. I'm sorry? Oh, the question was, are these places still there? No, because then Mayor Giuliani was elected, and that was, the bulldozers came out in full force. And then he also had the police give homeless people summons for camping without a permit, which wasn't a law I knew that was on the books in New York, but it is. And so they would get these summons and have to go down to court. And there'd be these, the fine's $50, and then the judge would just throw it out because it was such an absurd idea. But so he did a big crackdown, and there still are a lot of homeless people. There are actually, statistically, more than ever, a lot more families and children. But people are not in Manhattan living outside too much. I'm seeing more and more, actually. I've seen a lot more since 2008. But there's really, certainly under Bloomberg as well, very strictly controlled. There are no communities forming in Manhattan. Actually, my fourth book was about a group of people who live in an abandoned building because it became important to be invisible. And it also became important to be alone and not be in communities because communities attract attention. But there still are a lot of homeless people in the early morning just sleeping. Tompkins Square Park is closed from midnight till 6 in the morning. But in the at 5 in the morning, there are a lot of homeless people sleeping around the outside of the park, and then they go in at 6 o'clock and just sit, but they can't lie down. So these were really 1997. The last homeless community in Manhattan was bulldozed, actually to make way for the Trump building project, the Trump Tower. So even more ironic that the dirt and bulldozing and the digging the foundation for the Trump project was the dirt that was used to fill in the homeless community. So the ironies continue. But yeah, that's a good question because it's a complex one. Okay. I took it very, very slow. It depended on the community. When I went to Bushville, the first person I ran into was Hector Amasquita, and I said, "This is amazing what you've created here," and he was very pleased to show it to me. Tompkins Square Park, I actually went to first, and that was 1989, and a policeman saw my camera and he stopped me at the entrance because there were 150 homeless people living in there, and the police were omnipresent. And he said, "If anyone tries to steal your camera, don't come running to me because I'm not going to help you." And so I thought, oh, this might be a difficult thing. And but then, of course, when I saw Nathaniel Hunter's home, that was the one I wanted to photograph because it was so huge compared to everyone else's. And Nathaniel wasn't home at the time, and so I asked someone who had a smaller tent next door, and he said, "Well, you have to ask Nathaniel," and pointed to the large tent, because he decides everything in the park. So I just kept going back to visit until I ran into Nathaniel, and I said, "I really just want to photograph your home and garden. I don't, I'm not trying to exploit you or photograph you in any way." And he was perfectly happy with that and very proud of it, and then told me all these stories, which made me realize soon after that I needed a tape recorder because it was so amazing to hear the stories in people's own words, and I wanted to preserve that as well. And I kept an touch with Nathaniel until he died, which was just the year before last. And he always had this thing about sweeping up the park and sweeping the area around his tent. And so after the police evicted the homeless community twice and closed the park, Nathaniel started hanging out at a park. I think it's called Columbus Park. It's down in Chinatown near the courthouse. And he's just started sweeping up and cleaning up there. And then the Parks Department hired him, which was so wonderful. And they let him live in, there's a beautiful little old building from the 30s in that park. And they let him live in it. And these things never happen. And it was really wonderful. And he continued to maintain this park beautifully. And he was the mayor of that park then, and officially, more officially. And so I'd go down there and visit him. And then I saw him really right before he died. I just ran into him on the street in the East Village, and he had a stroke. And but all that time, he was doing the same thing. It's just that he then had it more officially recognized. So it's kind of an incredible story. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. No. Well, yes, I should say yes. The very first one I showed you in the Puerto Rican community with the painted rock gardens and the porch and all the beads hanging down, that was by Yvette and Monin, who were a couple, but they were both Puerto Rican, which was more important to the homeless people in that community. You had to be Puerto Rican, or they didn't want you there. And so that was theirs, and it was, they lived there. I went there 2.5 years, about 2 or 3 times a week, and they lived there really the first year, and then they got into some type of housing. And that was unusual. But the house had been existing before they moved in, but not in the form they did it. They painted it. They added the rock garden. There was a little garden on the side, very tiny. And they did all the decorations, and it was really tiny. I mean, I went to sit on the front porch to talk to them one day, and there was like almost room for the width of the chair. And but it was just such a little gem. It was this perfect little house. And when I showed the photographs to Pepe Otero, who lives just a couple houses down, he said, "Why don't you cut out the background?" And what he meant was, he said, if you do, it will look just like Puerto Rico. And this is about Yvette and Monin's house. And I said, first he said, "Why don't you cut the background out of your photograph?" And I was like, wait a minute, it's my photograph. And he said, no, get some scissors, we'll cut the background out. And then he explained it was so it would look just like rural Puerto Rico. And then that was very early on in the project, and that's when I started to think about people are recreating their happier times, usually childhood, because often they came here very young. And so those, what you see in the background of that photograph are the projects on Avenue D, and they're ironically called the Jacob Riis Housing Project. And they're very, I've been up in them, they're very tough, a lot of things happen there, and they're, very, very different world than what, in terms of safety, than what was actually created in this little community, because people really looked out for each other there, very much so. Mm-hmm. Okay, I see. Yeah.
Can you talk just a little bit more about the health issues you observed since underground?
We need the human mic for the health issues. Well, yes, I can. People really haven't. I've stayed in touch with everyone that I could. When I did the epilogue for my book, Fragile Dwelling, that was about the above-ground dwellings, that was my third book, right, because the tunnel was in between. I did the epilogue, so it was quite a few years later, and 1/4 of the people that are in that book had died, which is a lot. And they died sometimes from natural causes, but also a lot of accidents. It's kind of a heartbreaking story of some of the things that happen to people. Sometimes people would tell me things and I wouldn't, it was too hard to believe. You know, Mark was found dead in the bottom of a recycling bin, stabbed to death, you know, and I thought, no. And buried on Potter's Field. And so I would, you know, I'd do the long search. I'd have to find which precinct. The riverfront was right on the 2 precincts. It spanned 2 precincts, so I'd have to go to talk to detectives at those precincts, try to find out the story. The public affairs, Ellen Borkoff at the medical examiner's office in Manhattan is incredible. I mean, she just worked so hard to help me find out, or if I heard that one of the men from Bushville was found dead on the side. He'd been sleeping on the sidewalk after that demolition, and he was just found dead there one day from natural causes. And so, but you know, someone tells you these things, and then so she would track it down, with, you know, what information I could give her, and she always figured everything out for me. And so it's kind of amazing, and that how short lives really are of having lived in environments like that. A lot of the tunnel people that are still alive, and several have died, have lung diseases, and so it's a dangerous place for your health and safety. Mm-hmm. No. Not at all. Not from the city. Coalition for the Homeless is amazing. And Mary Brosnahan is the director. She started there very young as an intern, and she's, I don't know how many years now, I've lost track, but I've known her since early on in my project. And I always turn to her when I see someone needs help. And she's been incredible, because when there was a pressure for the tunnel people to be very brutally evicted initially, the tunnel people were being threatened, and I went to her and she said, I'm going down there with you tonight. And I don't think she knew what she was getting into. I mean, I'd been going there 5.5 years, 3 times a week, and so I was used to it, but she was such a trooper. She is such a trooper. She was amazing. And so she went down there and she talked to the people, and she put a stop on it. She called Henry Cisneros, and who was then Secretary of Housing under the Clinton administration, and she, this is the first term of Clinton, and as you know, Cisneros sadly had to leave because of personal just discretions, but he was amazing in terms of the homeless people on a federal level, and while the city was against them under Giuliani, and he tapped this emergency fund he had that could house people who were living, well, it was technically in subway tunnels, so he had to quickly rewrite it for people who lived in underground tunnels, because that was a freight tunnel. And they were, gradually they had to do a lot of paperwork. You have to have a birth certificate, you have to have a social security number, all those things that don't exist if you're living in an underground tunnel. Birth certificates were lost, decades before. And everybody was not legal. The illegal immigrants, unfortunately, were not able to come in under this program. But an enormous amount of the tunnel people were housed in Section 8 housing thanks to this. So I went to a lot of meetings. I went to a lot of meetings also about the demolition of the Puerto Rican homeless community, and got thrown out of several by those people, the poor people that were looking down into the lot. And because they were convinced they were all these drug dealers, and they weren't. They were these elderly Puerto Rican men, but drug dealing gangs did go through there all the time and just use it as a place to deal. And then, as Pepe Otero had shopping carts protecting his windows, so that because of them, so they needed protection from them too, not just the people in the apartments. But so it's a process. The city was not supportive. I went to city meetings, and reported back to Mary Brosnahan that they were saying, well, yes, the federal government has given us this money, and they say no strings are attached. We're to move those people from the tunnel right into housing, but we know that they won't be housing ready. And so I took my photographs, and I said, you don't call this housing ready? They found the materials, they built the houses, they furnished them, you know, they have pets that they're maintaining, they have gardens. And this one woman like swept my books across, she swept my photographs just off the table. She just took her hand and, you know, that's how the city felt about it. So I went back to Mary Brosnahan, and she called them up and said, a federal grant, no strings attached. You know, it was a social experiment too. What happens if you move people directly into housing? And when I reported this to the homeless people whom I was underground, whom I was trying to help, like, yes, you have to go to that meeting, and yes, you have to get a copy of your birth certificate, but this can happen. And convincing them, even when I didn't know myself always that it was for real, that when I told them what was going on, they said, where do these people think we lived before we became homeless? We lived in an apartment. We know how to stick a key in the door. We know how to turn on a water faucet. And so that was great. It gave me fuel to go back to the next meeting and say these things. And so they didn't have to sweep my photographs off the table. You know, they could just use common sense and think, oh, these people once lived in an apartment. They can do it again. And of course, a lot of them are still in these apartments. And they're doing really well. I go to visit them, and I'm amazed that they're just, you know, they're happy. They miss some things. They miss the freedom. They miss the shafts of light. You know, but it's other than that, they're safe and secure, and they're going to live a lot longer too, of course. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It does seem that, I have to laugh, you know, Bloomberg's on this campaign for the 250 square foot apartment, you know, so that more of these kind of young, technologically savvy people can afford to live in Manhattan, since nobody can afford to live in Manhattan anymore, and he wants this kind of young blood for the tech startups. And everyone's going, 250 square feet. I mean, a studio's typically, you know, maybe 400 or 500 square feet, and that's pretty small. And so there's a lot to be learned, you know, about how to create an orderly life. And a lot of these are 8 feet by 8 feet and 8 feet tall, you know, because they're using the plywood, 4 by 8 plywood. And but you're right. The architects that I've talked to, or building code people I've talked to, say that they feel that the turn of events came when the building code outlawed the cold water flat. That when the cold water flat existed, actually people could live in very low rent places. So sometimes the building codes work against people. So maybe with the introduction of the 250 square foot apartment, the cold water flat will get reintroduced, and those of us who've lived through Hurricane Sandy know that, you know, cold water is okay for a week, you know, you just deal with it some other way. And so it's really interesting. I agree with you. I think there's something that could be said here. Even with the enticement of an apartment, the tunnel people, some of the tunnel people, they didn't want to abandon their pets, and public housing doesn't allow pets. And they thought, this dog and these 18 cats got me through this, and I can't leave them. They saved my life, and I can't leave them and abandon them. And so there's a lot. Your question's so good, because there's so many things that people need to think about. And public housing, you're not allowed to put any decoration or ornament, and these photographs, as you can see, they're all, these images, these houses, they're all about that, this idea of personalizing. So there's so much to be learned that could work. I think there could be this wonderful compromise, and that not only the brightest and the best should get the 250 square foot apartments. There's no plan of low-income housing at that size, and so there's so much experimentation that could be done with this. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're probably out of time. I don't know. So.
There actually are a few minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You mentioned mayors and salsa music and communal cooking. I was wondering if there were other examples of public or semi-public activities being invested in shared spaces of these communities.
Yes, there are some. I was kind of saving those for the DCCA, Delaware Center for Contemporary Art talk tomorrow night, because I thought they're trying to get the community involved in their organization. And but there definitely are in the south end of the tunnel where you saw all the shanties. Those were all Spanish-speaking, not all from the same place in Spain, but Nicaraguan, Dominican, Puerto Rican, just a real combination of Spanish-speaking, and they would cook communal meals. And so that's one example I really saw. It just created this language, this enclave of language and communal cooking, and definitely, usually the connection is a cultural one and speaking the same language, and so that they have music in common and food in common, and but yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sorry. I got a lot of light in my voice. Mm-hmm. Well, bathrooms are a big problem. The tunnel people during the warmer seasons, when they were unlocked, would use the bathrooms in Riverside Park sometimes. But I mean, obviously, the tunnel's 2.5 miles long, and the entrance and exits changed all the time because they're just these metal gates, and the Parks Department was always padlocking them, and then the homeless people would saw the padlocks off and then kind of put them back so they looked okay, but really they put their own padlock on with it, and that's what really worked. But then it was how you got in was changing all the time, and so it just wasn't feasible always, especially in the winter when those bathrooms were closed. So what they would do is there was kind of this, it's 2.5 miles long, so it's communities. The Spanish people, Spanish-speaking people were in the south end, and then Bernard was like past midpoint. He was very deep into the tunnel, and he had about 7 or 8 people with him. And then there was the Vietnam vets that were in between those two, and so Joe and Kathy would be with that group, and they would have kind of a designated area, but everybody was to use it. And I mean, I went 3 times a week for 5.5 years, so I had to use it also. And so that, like there were designated areas, but they were, and it's so dark down there. I mean, it was very private because there was no light, but still there are a lot of rats running around, and I didn't find it very comfortable, but that's what people did. And in the Puerto Rican community, they really used kind of like what you saw in that one photograph that was a vacant lot, just kind of those hospital toilets are just portable, but they don't flush or anything. There's no water supply. People use the fire hydrants for water, and someone in every community miraculously had one of these wrenches that opens fire hydrants, and I don't think those are easily available, but they all seem to have one. And the person that had it would get paid $1 to go there for someone, and so they, collected 20 cans, and that was the $1 for this person, or gave them the cans using the barter system. And they would go to the fire hydrant and fill up bucket of water, 2 buckets of water for them, and bring it back, or people would go themselves also. But it was the controller of the ranch they controlled the access to the water, and it was usually not very close by. It was usually quite a walk, so they had little kind of carts that they would put it in, or old shopping carts. So it was a major effort, and the tunnel was a big effort to get water. Bernard was very sociable, and there was a gas station that would let just him get water. And the other people, it was just a really long walk underground, because once you got to the ends of the tunnel or to one of these gates, you had either to go up very steep stairs or climb a metal rung ladder. So it was really not easy to get in and out of the tunnel. So it's with great difficulty. I mean, water is a huge problem, too. And there's no electricity, except in a couple places where people wired to the street lamps. But you have to live close enough to a street lamp. You can do an underground wire and conceal it, of course. So, and have the knowledge to do it. But there were a few of those very innovative people that had electricity. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much to Margaret.
Thank you.